Hi, I'm Jenny and I'm a member of the Baltic Crew team. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Chris Killip retrospective exhibition that we have here on the ground floor of the gallery. So this exhibition has come from Photographers Gallery and we're really excited to have it here at Baltic, partly because it features so many photographs of the northeast where we're located. So Chris is one of the most important and influential post-war photographers from the 20th century and particularly works in the medium of documentary photography. Chris sadly died in 2020. He was terminally ill and knew that he was dying. So in the months before he died, he actually started to put together work and prepare a retrospective and a large-scale book of his life's work. So he made the first cut of all of the photos that you see in the exhibition and printed almost all of them himself by hand. His family, after he died, asked Ken and Tracy, the curators of the show, to curate this collection of photos. They had that difficult job after Chris had died to edit down that selection further and put together a cohesive show of his work. So Ken and Tracy, they knew Chris through his life. They were both photographers. Tracy's a curator as well. Ken actually assisted Chris when they were both a lot younger as well. So the show really begins with the series of photos Chris took in the Isle of Man. He didn't actually have a camera when he grew up on the Isle of Man, and he was employed as a beach photographer, so the camera came with the job there. He then moved to London and worked as a photographer's assistant for a number of years in advertising, and then became a freelance assistant and became a really well-respected photography assistant there. He then went on a trip to New York, and that's where he saw his first ever photography exhibition, and he was really influenced by this. So photographers like August Sander, Walker Evans, and Henri Cartier-Bresson were all big influences on Chris's work. He decided he really urgently needed to go back to the Isle of Man, where he's originally from, and take photos documenting the way of life there. So these photos are really taking direct influence and kind of borrowing from Paul Strand's Outer Hebrides series, and he's very honest about that. So you see a lot of portraits of people from industries at the Isle of Man. Partly why Chris felt the urgent need to take these photographs was because he could see that the Isle of Man was changing. So a lot of people from the financial industries were moving into the Isle of Man as it became known as a tax haven, and that was really threatening the way of life there. So from the traditional industries like agriculture and farming and milling and so on. So Chris started to go on photography tours. He would often travel through the night to avoid costs of accommodation and to save time as well. And a couple of commissions brought him to the northeast of England, where Baltic is situated. So you can see some photographs here of Middlesbrough and Huddersfield, both in kind of north-northeast England. And this one gives us the first kind of hint as to the style that Chris starts to develop and his real interest and focus in his later photographs. So Chris became really interested in industrial towns, and he kind of set out on a mission to photograph as many different industries as he could. He also really fell in love with the northeast and settled here for a number of years. So he lived in Newcastle and then in Gateshead as well. So while living in Gateshead, Chris was one of the founders of the Side Gallery, which is still going now, although they are struggling at the moment with their funding. So this exhibition is a great opportunity for us to talk about Side and its influence. So Chris became the director of the Side Gallery for a number of years in the 1970s. Chris said about his own work, "I wanted to record people's lives because I valued them. I wanted them to be remembered. If you take a photograph of someone, they're immortalized, they're there forever. For me, that was important, that you're acknowledging people's lives and also contextualizing people's lives." So this set of photos that we move on to next are all carrying on from the wall behind, all taken in the northeast. And Chris talked about in these photos how it wasn't until looking back with hindsight that he could see he was really the chronicler of the deindustrialization revolution. So at the time, he just wanted to take photos of what he saw and people who he said had history done to them. This photo is a brilliant example of the way Chris was struck by domestic life sitting next to industry. So you can see the pit head here in the background, and very close to it a house, probably a house built for a mine worker, and then close in there's a baby girl looking out the window there. I believe that the adult woman who is in this photo as a baby has actually been to see their photos, as have many of the people photographed in the show. So one of the series that Chris is best known for locally is his series of shipyards and shipbuilding on Tyneside, so at places like Wallsend. So you can see in these photographs, this is the last super tanker that was ever built on Tyneside. It's called Tyne Pride. And it gives a great example of why Chris wanted to photograph at the shipyards. So he was struck by this dramatic scene of just rows of housing with colossal ships kind of very close next to them being built in the docks. This was a big industry in the northeast that is now completely gone. So young people like myself have grown up hearing a lot about this industry. My own father was actually a model maker, making model ships for the shipyards. So I've grown up hearing about this industry, but never actually seeing it. So that's something I'm very grateful to Chris for taking these photographs and documenting these scenes, which to the people living and working here at the time were just very everyday. So a few years ago, Chris actually gifted these photographs to the Laying Art Gallery in Newcastle. He felt that these photos belonged to Tyneside and to the people who worked in the shipyards. So next in the exhibition, we get to a couple of sets of very distinct series of photographs. First is Skinningrove. So Skinningrove is a small village in North Yorkshire. It's on the kind of northeast coast of England, but further south than where we are now. They were fiercely protective, in Chris's words, of their beach and of their fishing industry. So the people that Chris photographs here were very resistant at first to Chris photographing them. It took him a few attempts to start to photograph there, but it was meeting a man called Leslie, which really helped Chris start to be able to photograph more comfortably in this area. So Lazo can be seen here on the left of the bench, and he features in a lot of the photographs. He and Chris built up a really good rapport with each other. Chris noted that Lazo never actually asked him why he was taking photographs in Skinningrove. He obviously just trusted that it was important that he did. Lazo was kind of at the core of his fishing community and reassured the other men in the village that Chris was okay, and how to kind of relax in front of the camera. The fact that Chris got to know the people in Skinningrove so well allowed him to take photographs like this one and this one here, where the people in the photo are clearly quite relaxed, despite Chris being there with a very large, quite clunky camera. So until the early to mid 2000s, Chris had only ever published about 3 or 4 photos from this series. That's because the series became very sad for Chris, and he was unsure what to do with these photographs, mainly because Lazo, who I've already mentioned, who's in this beautiful portrait here, himself and David Coultis, and this man here, Bever, were all in a fishing accident where Lazo and David sadly lost their lives and drowned. Bever was washed up ashore and survived. So after this accident, Chris didn't feel so comfortable publishing these photos. He did make some albums for families of the men who were lost at sea, and they were kind of very personal albums rather than publishing the photos in books. So the Skinningrove series ends with this incredibly poignant photo of Simon Coultis. He's the son of David, who died in the fishing accident. And this was Simon's first time out at sea after his father had died. Chris went on the boat for this trip and learnt that this was almost taken as a sort of ritual for a child of somebody who had died at sea, to make sure that they didn't become scared of the sea and of the fishing industry. So Simon actually got dressed up for this occasion. Chris said that he doesn't remember Simon saying anything on the trip, and he wondered what he must be thinking. This is taken on the way back. Chris mentioned that you can see Simon's getting cold and he's put his jacket on. So the next series in the exhibition is the Sea Coal series. So these photos were taken at Limaff in Northumberland, which is about 20 miles from Newcastle. So at Limaff, this travelling community were picking coal out of the sea and from the beach, and Chris was really struck by the scenes on this beach, which he described as almost medieval when he first saw them. Men on horses and carts, really kind of fishing this coal out of the sea. So something Chris was really fascinated with in the northeast was the way that the area is being built on coal fields. So in this particular colliery, the coal field went under the sea, and so the coal mine had then left deposits of coal, which later sea coalers would pick up. This coal that was mined would then go into the steelworks industry and shipbuilding industries, so he was interested in this kind of cycle that was happening in the northeast and thought that this beach was a perfect place to document that. So this separate side room of the exhibition is titled In the Time of Flagrante, from 1976 to 87. So In Flagrante was a groundbreaking book that Chris published, and it's the work that he's best known for. To produce In Flagrante, Chris was actually approached by a literary publisher called David Godwin in 1985. So up until this point, his photos had been published in photography journals and magazines and with photography publishers, but a literary publisher would reach a completely new audience and enabled him to think about how he presented the photos in a different way. He went for a more conceptual, metaphorical at times approach, and also quite a poetic approach as well with In Flagrante. The term In Flagrante actually means caught in the act of wrongdoing. So he doesn't explain to us in the book why he's titled it this. He's left that to our own reading. In 1985, Chris was photographing nightlife venues in Newcastle when somebody told him about a venue called The Station in Gateshead. Chris went for the first time and absolutely loved the energy of the station. From that point on, he went almost every Saturday and photographed there as well as watching the music performances. So what Chris really loved about the station was the way it had been built up as a grassroots venue by the people who it was for. The one photo of Chris himself in the exhibition is in a glass case that was taken at the station. So you can see Chris there in his usual suit with his huge large format camera and his flash wrapped in a plastic bag. He said that he would stitch extra pockets into his suit jacket to hold the plates that he used for his camera. So a large format plate camera, it can only take 2 plates at a time. It doesn't take rolls of film like we know most film cameras to take, and those plates had to be kept in the dark. So he'd kind of altered his clothing to actually work for photographing gigs like this, and he had his flash and battery for his flash tied around his waist as well. It's really nice to have a photo of Chris in the exhibition as well. He commented on how nobody at the station ever asked him about his presence, even though he was obviously quite a misfit as a 45-year-old man there with white hair and this suit. At the core of all of Chris's photographs in the exhibition is the care and tenderness that he showed towards the people he photographed. He really made it his life's mission to document these people who often went unseen. Chris stayed in touch with many of the people he photographed right up until the point he moved to America, where he became a lecturer in photography at Harvard University. He lived in America up until his death.